Amid the hustle and bustle of the holiday season, Iceland was busy with more than decking the halls. It was jailing its bankers for their role in the 2008 economic crisis. Now, in the wake of the meltdown, the Nordic island nation bailed out its citizen, leaving its banks to fail, and eagerly went after those who made the mess. Now, to date, Iceland has locked up 29 banksters for their role in the crash. But here in the United States, zero. Yes, zero banking executives have been singled out for investigation or prosecution for their role in the global economic quagmire. Now, the banks themselves, including those deemed too big to fail, have all paid fines that are nothing more than pocket change to these institutions. But even former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke has argued that obviously everything that went wrong or was illegal was done by some individual, not by an abstract firm. So how do we in the US punish our banking executives? Well, we give them multi-million-dollar bonuses and salary hikes. Here to discuss why that's the case and if it will ever change is Brandon Garrett, a law professor at the University of Virginia and author of Too Big to Jail. Thank you so much, Brandon, for joining me today. You know, last month you wrote about 2015 being a record year in prosecutions of wrongdoings, of corporations specifically, and of the $9 billion in total penalties paid by companies, $7 billion came from banks. Why the sudden shift?
Well, we are not seeing more companies getting prosecuted, even though a lot of people have called for prosecutors to get tougher on corporate crime, and the Department of Justice has said it's getting tougher on corporate crime. We aren't seeing more companies getting prosecuted. If anything, we're seeing fewer. What we are seeing is far bigger penalties. And one thing that happened in 2005, which really was unusual, is that so many of the companies that were prosecuted were banks. In fact, half of the companies prosecuted in federal courts last year were banks, and the bulk of the penalties, 7 of the 9 billion in penalties in these corporate criminal cases, was paid by banks. Some of that is likely to continue. Every year we've been seeing bigger and bigger cases being brought against financial institutions in terms of the size of the penalties they are paying. Part of the reason may be bigger and bigger crimes that banks are getting caught carrying out. And so when you have record-sized criminal schemes, you're going to get record-sized criminal fines.
And going off of what you just said, the DOJ vowed last year to stop letting corporate criminals off the hook, but then it declined to prosecute corporations like Boeing and GM officials in serious cases involving fraud and public safety. Why aren't individuals being held accountable for their actions?
Well, what I found is that particularly in these deferred and non-prosecution agreements that so many of the biggest corporations, the public corporations, negotiate with prosecutors, where they keep their criminal cases out of court. I've criticized those as being too big to jail type agreements. Well, individuals literally can go to jail, unlike a company. It's only about a third of the time that any individuals are even charged in these cases. And often when individuals are charged, it's not particularly high up individuals. Same is true for prosecutions of financial institutions. It's about the same. About a third of the cases you see individual bankers getting charged. But that's a real concern. And many high-profile people, Senator Warren, Judge Jed Rakoff, both Democratic presidential candidates, have said, wait a minute, these companies are paying enormous fines because they concede that terrible crimes were committed. They've admitted their crimes. They're accepting responsibility. They often describe these agreements with the companies, describe with some detail what the crimes were that were committed, often giving a sense of who the supervisors were, maybe not naming them. But you have a sense that there are people who did serious things, and yet the company pays $1 billion fine or a $10 million fine, whatever it is, and no employees are charged. And it's been very troubling. The Department of Justice says it's going to change its focus to prioritize investigating who did what. It's sort of shocking to us on the outside as observers that, wait a minute, that wasn't being done before. But clearly it wasn't a priority in the past, since we so often saw these settlements where one of the things that didn't happen was that you just didn't see individuals getting charged.
Right. I mean, considering what you just said, the U.S. is home to the world's largest prison population, many who are serving jail time for petty crimes and have been victim to the war on drugs. What do corporations and their employees know that the rest of the jail terming service public doesn't?
Well, it's a lot easier to prosecute lots of people for straightforward, easy-to-prove crimes like drug possession, for example. A huge chunk of the federal docket in terms of numbers of people are immigration prosecutions, where sometimes it's even conceded that the person overstayed their visa or is here illegally. They're going to be deported anyway, but prosecutors are tacking on a criminal sentence to something which is really a violation of immigration rules, a civil violation, which wouldn't be treated as a crime in most countries, but those are hard cases to process by the tens of thousands. Corporate crime cases really are far more complex, and it can be much more work to litigate them and figure out who knew what. It's really important to prosecute the corporation itself because only the corporation may have that full access to all the documents and emails and interviews with employees to try to figure out who actually knew what. And so in a corporate crime case, there may be an allegation that something that the business did was fraudulent. But who knew it was fraudulent? Was it the supervisor who signed off on it? Was it the 10 people working under the supervisor? Was it the general counsel or the accountant or the compliance officer who also signed off on the plan or the deal? But there may be lots of people working in groups, and specialization can make corporations effective and able to do remarkable things in society. It can also make it much harder to unravel criminal intent. And so these are absolutely expensive, difficult cases. Sometimes in the past, prosecutors have really tried and invested real resources into trying to bring lots of these cases, often with some real notable successes, and sometimes acquittals of high-level executives. I kind of think it's important to put criminal cases to the test. It's fine if difficult cases end up resulting in non-convictions of people maybe who shouldn't have been charged or where the case was difficult to make, but prosecutors need to try in cases that have such a involve such serious harms to the economy.
Right, and you make a very good point. And now we have the presidential elections coming up now with presidential candidates supported by big banks and corporations like Hillary Clinton and most of the Republican Party. How can we expect anything to change? Is there any candidate who might be above the manipulations of major money interests?
Well, I don't think that presidents are being manipulated in corporate crime cases. These cases are handled at the U.S. Attorney level and within the Department of Justice. It is true that serious public companies, financial institutions that get prosecuted will seek review of their case up to the highest levels in the Justice Department. So I do think it matters who our next U.S. Attorney is and what policies that U.S. Attorney has. We've seen really good changes come out of the Department of Justice under Loretta Lynch. Some of those were things that Holder was seriously thinking about before he left. And so I do think that the public criticism of the way these corporate cases have been handled really has impacted the Department of Justice, and it will hopefully continue to do so in the future. But I do think it matters that we have a president who is willing to appoint an attorney general that wants to take corporate crime seriously. I also think that it matters that there be a plan for how to tackle complex corporate crimes. It's not just enough to have an attorney general that says, "Oh yes, there's no such thing as too big to jail. We'll go after any crime if we find it." You're not going to find it unless you have real resources dedicated towards investigating these complex corporate crimes. And so, we've seen some really good statements on the Democratic side about the importance of allocating resources to corporate investigations, maybe the need for legislation to change the way that corporate investigations and prosecutions are handled. I've been really impressed with the detail of Hillary Clinton's proposals on this subject, and Sanders has made more general but strong statements on this topic. We haven't heard anything about the problems and the need to prosecute corporations on the Republican side, of course.
Well, thank you so much, Brandon. We look forward to having you on again soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much.